Hello again. Well, here we are, and we're talking about what I've started to call the Federalist Administration. It's the presidencies of President George Washington and John Adams, and it's in the first part of Chapter 8, up to the point when it talks about the Jefferson election and presidency. And we saw that what they're trying to do is to solve some of the problems that had been tearing the country apart under the Articles of Confederation. And we started last time by looking at the foreign issues. Foreign policy had been one of the really serious failures of the Articles, but under President Washington and then under President Adams, we solved those. We got Jay's Treaty with England, which restored good relations with England. We got Pinckney's Treaty with Spain, which restored good relations with Spain, gave us access to New Orleans, which was very important to us. And we finally settled the XYZ affair in a way that we did not go to war with France, but we got what we needed from France. We got them to accept our cancellation of the treaty. They gave it up. I don't know what was ever paid to them as compensation for that. I never saw the number. It was once we got over the hump of not paying bribes, it was just a matter of sitting down and coming up with a number, and they did it, and I don't even know what the number was. But it was an acceptable number, so worked out. Everything is fine. Now we've got to talk about the problems at home, which are basically that the economy of the United States under the Articles was in very seriously bad shape. And there were all kinds of problems. We talked about those before. We talked about the rivalry among the states to try to come up with policies to attack the other states. And everybody's trying to do that, so everybody's attacking everybody. And it's a mess. We've got the fact that states have debts that they haven't paid, and some states are doing very responsible things, like Massachusetts, which is being very responsible, but of course is putting very heavy tax burden on its people. And then you've got the other extreme, Rhode Island, which there's no tax burden on the people, but the rich people of the state are being screwed over by this so-called paper money scam that the state of Rhode Island has come up with. Well, there's just all kinds of things happening. But one of the sort of the central problem was that Congress could not tax. So Congress could not get any money for the country. You can't run a country without money. And we were trying to do that under the Articles, and it didn't work. It was a disaster. So, a lot of people today, they don't like taxes, but you need to face the fact that if you want to have a country, if you want to have a government, if you want to have a functioning country, you need money, and that means you got to tax. And I know people don't like it. They want to keep all the money for themselves, but it just doesn't work that way. You've got to have some taxes. So, one of the big things that the Constitution did was to give Congress the power to impose taxes. All right, so now, all of these economic issues are dumped in the lap of Alexander Hamilton, who, if you followed the notes, was the Secretary of Treasury for President Washington. And I'm going to look at Hamilton's program a little bit differently from your textbook. I'm going to pick out 3 big programs that he came up with to solve the problems, and we're going to take them one at a time. The first one was to deal with the very obvious fact that first thing you've got to do, you can't do anything until you get some money. So that means we've got to have some taxes. So one of the first measures that Hamilton came up with and submitted to Congress was a tax measure. We're going to start taxing. And the tax that Hamilton came up with as the first one, the major tax, was a very basic kind of tax that people were familiar with. It's a tax on imports, which we call a tariff. So the United States, which is a major trading nation, is going to tax that. I mean, that's an obvious thing to do. We imported a lot of stuff. Let's tax it. Eventually, maybe that's going to be passed on to the consumers in the form of higher prices, but that's the way it goes. That's what we need to do. So, as one of the first things that Congress dealt with in 1789, it started meeting, remember, in 1788. President Washington was inaugurated in April of 1789. But in 1789, early in the year, Hamilton presented to Congress a proposal for a tariff, the Tariff Act of 1789, and Congress passed it. It was not very controversial. Everybody more or less agreed we have to have taxes, we have to have money. Everybody more or less agreed that a tariff was a good way to go, it's a logical way to go, it's a sensible way to go. It's a tax that we can enforce fairly easily because we can have revenue agents at all the ports. There's a finite number of ports. There's a lot of ports on the East Coast, but that's a finite number. We can establish revenue agents at each port, and that when a ship comes in, the revenue agents can go aboard, see what its cargo is, assess the taxes, and collect it right there at the spot. It's an easy tax to do. It's a very obvious thing to do. And Congress had no problem with it. Remember I told you last time that we're hoping that we'll have a non-partisan Congress. President Washington had been elected in a non-partisan election. There was no political campaigning. And the tariff was not a political issue. There are no political parties. It could not be a political issue because there are no parties. Everybody's just sort of working together. They worked together, they agreed that this was the way to go, worked out the details. Had to come up with some numbers, and that's kind of a complicated process because you've got all kinds of products that you're going to be taxing. You've got to figure out what the tax is on each product. So it's a complex problem, but it's just something that you have to sit down and you just do it, and it's easy to do. And it's done in a very non-confrontational, non-partisan way. So it works fine, and this is what it is. Now, we're going to be hearing about the tariff more later, so let me explain something now before we get any further. I have to tell you a little bit about sort of the economic theory of tariffs. A tariff, as I said, is a tax on imports. And so it's possible, and normally, the importer, the American businessman who's going to sell the products to the American consumers, is going to raise the price in order to cover the tariffs. Now this is not a guarantee. This is what we used to call an indirect tax. Remember when there had been all the controversy over the tariffs of the British when they came up with the various tariffs on tea and everything else like that. The assumption is that it's going to raise the price, but it's not directly a tax on the people. It's a tax on the businesses. The businesses, at their discretion, may raise the price in order to get the money to pay the tariff. But that's up to them and how they do that. They do what they want. But the idea of this is twofold. There are two things that we can use for the tariff. The simplest and most basic thing is to provide income for the government. We call that revenue. The government gets revenue. So we can have a tariff for revenue. So you have a tariff, and this purpose is very simple: to make money for the government. That's obvious and easy. But something else might happen. If the businesses that import the products raise the price, it's going to make those imports more expensive. Now, in the United States, as of 1789, we did very little manufacturing. We had only a few kind of factories. They were small. They served only a local area. As I've stressed, America is a land of farmers, or small middle-class farmers. We import almost everything that we use. We have very few products of our own, and we import almost everything. One of the main reasons why there's so little manufacturing in America is because there's just not many people available to work in a factory. Most people own their own land. If they don't own their own land, they can work for somebody else. People are farmers. They're on the land. There's nobody available to go to work in a factory. Now, by contrast, in England, which is the obvious nation that we'd look at, there's lots of people who don't own land. Homelessness, joblessness, poverty has been a part of English life since we've been studying it. Very beginning of the semester, we talked about the reason why England was interested in America was because England had so many homeless, unemployed people that they couldn't place. Well, this means that there's a lot of people in England available to go to work as factory workers. Economists say labor is abundant. In other words, labor is cheap. That is, wages are low. Manufacturers in England have a very large army of desperate people to draw upon to come to work in their factories and willing to work at bare survival wages. So England has a large labor force being paid very, very low wages. In America, there aren't very many people available to work in factories. Factory labor is very expensive. You've got to pry people away from the farm to come to work in a factory, and that's hard to do. So one of the reasons why there's so little manufacturing in America is because wages are too high. And you might note as a comparison to today, the United States is today our big competing partner nation is not Britain, it's China, and China has a lot of cheap labor, and so it's very hard for American businesses to compete against the cheap labor in China. Well, it was the same thing in the 1780s. It's just that it was, instead of China, it was England. And American manufacturers had a hard time competing against English cheap labor. But the tariff, if it raises the prices of English goods, it may get to a point where the prices of manufactured products goes up so much that American manufacturers might become competitive. They might, although they have to pay higher wages, they don't have to pay the tariff. So the tariff is going to add to the cost of the product and maybe make American goods more competitive. So it can enable Americans to become manufacturers. It will protect American factories against the cheap labor available to English factories. So we call it a protective tariff. Now, when a tariff becomes protective, depends on all kinds of other factors. It depends on what the difference between labor rates in England and labor rates in America are. It depends on how much the manufacturer wants to raise the price. There's all kinds of variables. But if you start raising tariffs at a certain point, the tariff will start to act as a protective device to protect American manufacturing and American labor against the low wages of English labor. So people have used tariffs forever as a protective device. One of the standard features of mercantilist economic policy that we talked about in the earlier days. Mercantilists often relied on tariffs as a way to discourage imports and encourage local manufacturing. And I remember, if you remember about mercantilism, when I talked about it back in the good old days when we were in the classroom, the goal is to reduce imports, increase exports in order to get more gold. Well, one way to reduce imports is to tax them, is to put tariffs on. So tariffs is one of the basic tools of mercantilist economic policy. And economists knew about it, and they've known about it for hundreds of years. It's a very standard, obvious thing to do. So Hamilton is in a position where he can start encouraging American manufacturing by raising tariffs. But as of 1789, that was not his goal. His goal was simply to provide revenue for the government. So his tariffs were not high enough to provide protection. They would provide revenue, but even with that additional revenue, even with that raising of the price of the imported goods, it's not going to help. It's not going to raise the price enough to make American manufactured goods competitive. We still are going to have our labor is still going to be too expensive. You'd have to raise them a lot more. So you could do that. You could start raising tariffs and raise them and raise them and raise them until they started getting protective. But think about what is eventually going to start happening as you raise tariffs. When you first start out, the more the tariff is, the more revenue you'll get. But at a certain point, as you're raising the tariff, Americans are going to stop buying as many imported goods. They're going to start buying American-made goods, which of course is what you want. But it means that if we're importing fewer goods, we're not paying as much in tariffs. And the revenue is actually going to start going down. It's kind of ironic. You start raising the tariff, the revenue goes up. You keep raising it, the revenue goes up. But after a little while, you keep raising the tariffs, and there's a point at which revenue is actually going to start going down. And as a matter of fact, if you carry this to the extreme, and you carry it to the end, where the tariff is totally protective, that means there would be no imports. Americans would not have to compete at all against English goods, but there would be no imports. That means there would be no revenue. There would be no imports, there would be no tariffs. And that's not what Hamilton wants to do at this point. I mean, maybe we'll do that later. We'll think about encouraging manufacturing sometime in the future, but for now, the focus has to be on revenue. So we don't want to make the tariffs too high to start discouraging imports. You want to have a lot of imports and just tax them. So the tariffs that he proposed in 1789 were for revenue only. They had no protective features. I've mentioned this now because we're going to see later we're going to start raising tariffs and making them protective. But that's not yet. As of 1789, Hamilton's only purpose is just to get some revenue for the government, and he wants to get it so he can start dealing with the other problem here, the basic one of our debt. So now we've got to deal with the debt. To deal with that, Hamilton proposed a plan that we call funding and assumption. Funding and assumption. It'll be on the list of terms that you'll get from each week. I hope you're getting those. If you're not, tell me, because I'll have to arrange with my technical assistant to get those terms to you. And one of them will be funding and assumption. Now, this issue of the debt is complicated. It's not just one thing. First of all, there's debts owed by Congress, and then there's debts owed by state governments. During the war, many states had borrowed money. Congress had borrowed a lot of money. States had borrowed money. Congress was using the money for the Continental Army. States were using the money for their militias. So there's, both state and, if you will, congressional debts. And then congressional debts are kind of complicated because about half the money that we borrowed was borrowed from foreigners. The other half was borrowed from Americans. So you've got several things to deal with in the debt. And in discussions of it, there have been several proposals about what to do about these different forms of debt. And after a little break here for technical reasons, I'll look at what those proposals were.